Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business by Frank Bold, the European Public Interest law firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years leading responsible business issues inside the European Parliament, I host our discussion of the latest developments in the fields of corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, Europe's new simplified sustainability reporting standards for business, the ESRS, our essential guide to what the changes mean and how you might like to respond to the consultation which is open now. Our guides are two members of the technical expert group at EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, who worked on the new simplified standards. First, we have Sandra Atler, who is also Director of Human Rights and Business Practice at Enact Sustainable Strategies. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you, Richard.
And we also welcome Signe Lysgaard, who is also Chief Advisor on Business and Human Rights at the Danish Institute of Human Rights, and she's a former member of the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance. Good day to you, Signe.
Good day, Richard, and thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right. Now, we all know the political environment in which the simplification of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS, is taking place. But we'll come back to that. Let's just actually focus on what's different. So what is, at a big picture overview level, what's different in the new ESRS than what we saw before? Sandra first.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I think actually it's a good question to both to be asking and obviously to be answering. And as I was recapping to some colleagues the other day about what is it actually that we've done now that we're kind of stepping out of the process of all the work that has been going on in TEG, I was actually reflecting that it's a little bit like having your second baby. So when you have your first baby, you have all the checklists, you purchased all the goods, you're so well prepared, you got everything in place, you really got, you're so focused that you don't know what the core is, you don't know what's important and so forth. But when you have your second baby, a little bit like now the revised version of the European standards, we've really focused on the core. We've got rid of the stuff that isn't as important. So, what's the essence? What's less important? What is really mandatory? What is really kind of secondary? What is the guidance? Removing duplication, things that we didn't need the last time. Making sure it's streamlined, making sure it's more in harmony with itself across the standards, but also with other standards. And making sure that there is flexibility where there should be flexibility, reliefs where something can be kind of a little bit more flexible and a little bit more at ease when possible, so that it's really kind of, again, coming to the core and presenting that in a way that is more clear to the reader. So that's the very short one.
You're selling it very well there, but second babies as well as first babies have birth pains, and I think it's been quite a painful process.
Yes.
Signe, what's, again, at that overview level, what's changed?
What's changed is for one, if you want to, the size of it, right? So I think one of the things that folks reacted to in the first instance was, whoa, this is long. If I can't even print it out. So there we had a different final product. We've reduced length by more than half. We've reduced data points, if you count mandatory ones only, by almost 60%. If you count all of them, by almost 70%. So you're looking at a standard that's really lighter, if you would, in terms of what's in it. Lighter without having lost, I would say, its integrity, because there's been prioritization in what has been now trimmed or simplified. And then that sort of trimming has been combined with also looking at, can we make this easier? So not only shall this stay or shall this go, but also, is it overly complex? Why have we written this in a way that one needs to read 3 times? Can we write it in a simpler way? Those sorts of things are also, I would say, welcomed with the new version, that it's just more intuitive, and perhaps importantly for companies, more fit to allow them to tell their story, if you would, in a way that is cohesive and goes from what are our impacts, what are we doing about them, what is still in front of us.
There'll be a lot in businesses listening in to this who will welcome what you've both said there. But one of the things that frustrates me about on the data points argument, so I've been in so many meetings about the former ESRS where they said, well, there's 1,000 plus data points. There was 800. It had already been cut down. And then because of the double materiality assessment, for most companies, it was 100 to 200. And so this obsession that I think politicians have about the number of data points, which EFRAG a bit is playing to by saying we 60 to 70% less, is that really a reduction in burden? Is that really going to help business and investment? Let me just challenge you there, Signe, on what you think of that.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a crack at it. I mean, I agree with your point there that there's been an over fixation on this number of data points, as if everyone had to report on each and every data point, which was never the case, not in the first instance, not in the new version. That being said, people like to quantify, I guess, right? And this was one way of conveying how much content was there in the standard, and therefore also in the new version, giving this figure about how much has been reduced is one way of conveying that there's been a significant overhaul. But I agree, it's also about, another part of it is also about fully conveying what how the standards are developed, and the essence of the materiality assessment, and how that really ends up deciding what a company reports and not, and therefore not getting overwhelmed or bogged down on this data point number, as if that's the sort of golden standard.
And getting rid of all of the voluntary data points, that's a sweeping change, sounds very good to politicians. I think there's a lot of people in companies that quite like guidance on if they're going to report on an issue, how they do it. And I think that's a loss, I have to say. You talk about the double materiality assessment. I don't know, Sandra or Signe, who would like to answer this. But we all know that the double materiality assessment is absolutely crucial in the sustainability reporting under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and these standards. And it's the way that the Commission, working with EFRAG, simplified in the past to say everything is based, if it's not material, don't report it. How does the double materiality assessment change in the new standards compared to the old ones? Who'd like to deal with that? Sandra.
I can start. Well, I think in practice it's a little bit like the birth pains, like you talked about, Richard. It's a mix of birth pains and also kind of, getting your head around something that is legislation and something that is new. So you're going to go line by line, right? And auditors and preparers and consultants and they want to kind of make sure that they're diligent. So in a way, it's the response that the market has provided us with in terms of the very, very detailed reporting exercises where, the list of all the possible topics have been compiled in Excel sheets, and each and every single issue has been rated for severity, has been evaluated regardless of kind of its relevance to the organization. So kind of this compliance approach that has developed, that has given us so much detail, that has this, I think this is part of what has kind of been the burdensome exercise. I mean, this was never the intention, and you could have read the previous one as well in a lighter way. But I think now the solutions that we have tried to kind of insert or make sure that is more prominent is making sure that companies can more kind of start from more a company-centric perspective. So, focusing on your inherent challenges to your business model, making sure, clarifying that there is flexibility. Companies don't have to report on every single thing that isn't material. So, and actually, Richard, just to give you an example. So we had a client, and this is a company that owns many properties and contributes to emission of greenhouse gases. So they had this one very big Excel file, like I think a lot of companies will recognize. They had all the subtopics listed from the standard, and they went through each of them, estimating the the severity, the scale, the scope, the mediability, likelihood, and then applying thresholds. And they had a model where this Excel sheet was calculating, right, what was supposed to be then material. It was quite interesting. We spoke to a colleague at the company, and they said, we were quite surprised. We didn't know that climate change wasn't material to us. So this equation system, right, had told them that no, climate change isn't material to us, in spite of them knowing very well at the start that it was, because of this kind of built-in equation. So I think that's kind of a good reminder that we want to make sure that we are starting with the obvious thing. We want to make sure that we do it more company-centered. We don't have to do it in the perfect way. We don't have to document every single thing. And so I think this has been clarified. Also, inserting things like, this fair presentation framework in alignment with the ISSB, IFRS standards, and so forth. So I hope that this is going to provide more understanding for preparers, but also for auditors, that it's okay to be more flexible and to tell your story, and to make sure that documentation. Of course, we want the documentation and we want the systematic approach. That's something we don't want to lose. So we don't want it to be completely subjective, of course. But we want to make sure that this example of this company, right, is not where we end up in the end.
And I think the assurers and the data providers were partly at fault for us doing topic by topic by topic, which has put so many companies off. So I think that's welcome. I think the undue cost and effort clause, which is now in there, was in the rest of it, but is now in there. I think companies will welcome that. But Signe, that in that section, it actually talks about primary users, e.g., for example, investors, and then general users. And the whole point of double materiality is the reporting is for all stakeholders. And that's the big difference between the global and the European standards. So I worried a bit when I read that. What was behind that?
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. I mean, one of the things that would change was the approach to defining materiality of information, or rather clarifying what is this filter of materiality of information, in addition to materiality assessment of the impacts, risks, and opportunities themselves. And there it rightly speaks of these two different groups of users. And I actually think it strikes a balance there between saying, the materiality of information filter test is both what does primary users is the word used, but essentially sort of traditional users, if you would, of financial reports, sustainability reports, i.e. the investors, the financial institutions. What do they need? Is this fit for purpose in terms of being decision useful information? But it also recognizes that there are other users, other stakeholders. It could be trade unions, civil society groups, others in society at large that need, and that materiality of information test for them needs to also unpack, is the information fit to make it understandable for this group of users, what our impacts are and what we are doing to manage them. So I would say that indeed there's a dot materiality emphasis retained. There's emphasis on impact and materiality still. And that there's been that balancing act of trying to ensure that that both dimensions were kept. Could there be further refinement? Probably, but I would say that I would actually largely welcome that this balance of the two dimensions have been retained but simplified.
But with a hierarchy of one over the other, which seems strange if one is to apply genuine double materiality. But let me ask it from the other point of view, on financial materiality, the global approach that's taken. One of the things that EFRAG claims is that the new standards, the new ESRS, are closer to the global standards, the IFRS standards, as they're known, international financial reporting standards, and yet a relief, which means a delay, a relief is not to have to analyze, for companies, is not to have to analyze the financial materiality of sustainability, which I accept has been difficult, I think, in the first wave, and companies have found that difficult, and it is difficult. But surely it's at the core of what the global standards are about, and so that seems to be taking the European standards further away from the global standards rather than near. Here, I don't know who would like to respond to that. Sandra.
Do you want to go first, Signe?
Can do. So on ISSB IFRS alignment, I mean, this was an explicit goal, if you would, or instruction as well, to try and align where possible, right? So I think there's been efforts to do so, and then there's been efforts where, in a way, it went beyond, and so the simplification led to misalignment, if you would, or divergence, because there were the introduction of reliefs that aren't there in IFRS. And I think this is one to be probably discussed and looked at, right, in the consultation and in the finalization of the standards. Has the simplification exercise gone too far here? Is this real simplification? Because it will lead to a divergence between those reporting along one or the other. Should the IFRS be the floor, if you would, in terms of where, for instance, the reliefs can go to, and then no further? So I think those are discussions that are likely to come in this next phase of finalization.
And I would accept that the language has been quite radically changed to align and be the same, not just align, be the same in IFRS standards and in ESRS European standards. And I think a lot of people and companies will welcome that. In your last answer there, Signe, you said perhaps in a few cases gone too far. Inevitably, this is a birth pang, painful process. And there were some things that just got over the line that were cut out that you might have had concerns about, and our wider audience listening to Frankly Speaking might want to say, hang on, bring those back in.
Mm-hmm.
So we've sold it a lot in the first part of this podcast. So can I put to both of you now, perhaps Sandra first, what were the issues of concern that have been taken out of the standards that you really wondered and worried about, and that perhaps might come back in?
So, I mean, I think it's kind of one of these balancing acts, right, that we have to do, whether you look at it from a more granular and detailed perspectives. You could argue, and as a human rights lawyer by training, I do think, you know, that it is a loss that we've lost a lot of the granularity. In the beginning, Richard, you also gave that example, which is very much true. I think, you know, we talk about guidance or data points having been kind of removed or pulled into the voluntary guidance part, but in doing so, you are also losing the granularity. You're also losing the specifics. So in that, because not everyone is an expert on every single part of these standards, you're going therefore to be probably getting more generic statements and more generic disclosures from companies when you are removing these examples, the guidelines, and so forth. So I think that's kind of a general pity. But at the same time, I think that, you know, this is probably part of the pains that we have to go through. I think that a lot of the granular details that we've lost in terms of S1, but also in terms of the E standards, so the environmental standards, it's a pity indeed that we've lost the nuances and the examples. But I do think still that some of the most important components kind of are still in place. Having said this, also going back to your question, so anticipated financial effects of the environmental standards, so pollution, water, biodiversity, that's an area where I think, you know, previously we would have really kind of welcomed and hoped that we would take a step forward and having companies quantify and qualify better the cost, but now giving this relief is kind of really leaving a vacuum. So I think that's a really big pity. And then also some of the granularities, for example, you know, breakdown by gender in S1, so for your own workforce. Of course, companies can still provide the details and the more specific breakdowns, but I think that that type of granular information is ultimately what's really also interesting to a lot of stakeholders. But then again, maybe this is the cost we have to pay to actually get double materiality on the map where impacts are seen as part of what companies have to disclose. So depending on how you see it, but I think those are some of the kind of major challenges. And then we also have, a number of things that are also, we should remember that this is out for consultation, right? So for example, what you just discussed with Signe, or what Signe said about how far should we go in alignment with the IFRS and the costs, right, and the reliefs on that. Well, there's a consultation here out, and I think it's really important that we keep an eye on that and make sure that stakeholders hopefully bring their viewpoints to that, to say, well, what is enough? Like what is the balance there? How far are we willing to let that go? As well as other topics. For example, we also have two other tricky conversations out for consultation regarding adequate wage and gross versus net, how to estimate that, but we might get back to that.
Yes, I'll definitely get back to on gross v net, but on adequate wage, say a word about that now.
So the adequate wage, the challenge here has been that, well, first of all, you have the obligation to report or to disclose whether you are providing adequate wage, but the challenge has been how you estimate this for EU states versus non-EU states, and not the EU side, but the non-EU sides. And so in practice, there's a possibility to in the methodology to talk about the adequate wages, but to rely on minimum wages. So when they are mandated by law in other countries, there's a possibility to use that definition. And in practice, that means that you're not going to have comparative information, right, about wages paid for on an own workforce in the EU versus outside. So this is, of course, problematic, and this is an area where we have there's a consultation, like we mentioned, and there's going to be like deep interviews, surveys, and so forth with experts. So I do believe we're going to be able to resolve it, but this, I think, is one of the things that in any event, regardless simplification or not, would have been to be resolved.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, for all those people that advocate for the living wage, it's a step away from that. So I'm sure that will be part of the consultation. On that or on anything, Signe, where are your concerns? Where are your missing items?
Perhaps I'll then start in the adequate wage corner and then zoom back out to a couple of others, because indeed the adequate wage and getting the methodology right for non-EU workers is high on my list in terms of the points that I'm keen to get right in this last finalization stage. Not only because it leads to a non-comparable data across EU and non-EU, but also because minimum wages in many countries aren't adequate. So if we allow that to be the benchmarks de facto, we are in a way institutionalizing, if you would, a flawed methodology under the heading of adequate wages, and that's sort of contrary to the whole purpose of making it more transparent, but also driving change on a very important agenda, one that impacts millions of workers. So that's one that's very sort of technical, and the good news is that there's been a development. We now have ILO principles for estimating a living wage. They weren't there when we developed ESRS 1.0, if you would, or the original version. So there's a good benchmark to get this right, but we need the drafting to be improved from where it's at right now. Then maybe to complement some of the other concerns, in a way, one is sort of with this spirit of the approach, if you would. So we went from one that has an emphasis on compliance that was very prescriptive in order to get comparable data, but also to make sure it wasn't abused. And so it didn't rely, if you would, on the good faith of companies, or it didn't necessarily put a lot of trust on the companies, to one that does so, one that says, we're going to roll back some of the prescriptive elements, and then we're going to leave it to you to tell us this in a manner that makes sense to you. I'm overly simplifying, but right, that's how I see the shift in terms of the spirit of of the design of the approach. And for me, that might be a needed change, but with trust, if you would, trust in companies comes responsibility. So I am worried about misinterpretations, misuse, and loss of comparability because we are changing the approach overall. And that worry is underpinned by some of the reliefs that were introduced, right? That undue cost and effort, yes, it makes sense, but also, for own operations, shouldn't it be possible to collect this data where you have operational control? And so there are some, I think, of the reliefs where the compounded effect of the different multitude of reliefs, maybe we can't really see the effect of that until we start seeing the next wave of reports, if you would. Then I would say another key element to how the simplification was done was that there's been significant trimming at the topical level, which gives new importance or heightened importance to ESRS 2, because those simplifications at, for instance, the social topical level were only possible because it then relies on what's now called general disclosure requirements, used to be minimum disclosure requirements in ESRS 2 at the cross-cutting level. So we really need that sort of synergy between the cross-cutting standards and the topical standards to work well in the new versions, because we're at a very thin level, if you would, in terms of explicit disclosure requirements at the topical level, certainly for stakeholder groups beyond own workforce. Because for own workforce, we've retained a lot of the metrics, which will, let's say, lead to a bias or more disclosure for own workers. But for those other groups that are sometimes more at risk, if you would, from a sustainability perspective, workers in the value chain, to take an example, we have a very thin standard at this stage. And that means that we will rely on companies to really get it right in terms of what fair presentation means for sustainability reporting. It's a concept that came from financial materiality, but what does it really mean in the context of sustainability reporting? So those are some of the things that I think we'll have to reevaluate in a couple of years if this is how the standard ends up looking like, in terms of what is the impact of that shift of design approach, if you would, between 1 and 2.
And that phrase fair presentation being brought in is a major part of this change in ESRS. And I think those behind it would argue that it's going to back up and support judgment of the reporting company. But it is something we all need to get used to and to get involved with. Now we've just been talking, have the simplifications gone too far or not far enough? There will be some of our listeners who will be thinking that as well. And I've got two quotes to read you. First, from the then commissioner in 2023, who said, "The standards we have adopted today strike the right balance between limiting the burden on reporting companies while at the same time enabling companies to show the efforts they're making to meet the Green Deal agenda." And then the press release from EFRAG 2 years later, 2025, "These revisions remain ambitious, but do not overburden companies." So you've got two almost identical quotes 2 years apart. There will be cynics out there. I'm not a cynic, but there will be cynics out there that say, why should we believe either of them?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good one, Richard. And I think, also a testament to how this revision process wasn't driven by evidence, right? It wasn't us taking stock after 3 years of implementation, looking at whether it was working. And then, as we always do with regulation, look at, does it need adjustment and so on, in a natural flow. This was the product of an omnibus process, which also has a political component, right? And so I think that is what kick-started this, and also what in a way underlines how that framing is echoed a few years later, because it was true then, but you will also have it those say that it's true now, or at least also those that I think this is the last shot at getting it right. We need to now say it can't we can't keep messing around. We can't keep reopening and renegotiating this. We need to settle. The dust needs to settle, and we need to press on with the work. And that's why this is now the right way of doing it.
Sandra, too far or not far enough?
Well, it's a bit like asking, right? It's like, is the rope long or short? I mean, it's all about what you compare with. I think that we have seen, although Signe, you're right, it isn't, we don't have like a number of years to compare reporting on, but we have seen a little bit of the head start. We have seen through, for example, the report State of Play by BCG together with EFRAG. So we've seen a little bit of the developments, and I think that well, obviously it's up to stakeholders to determine, but I think that a lot of, even though we've been complaining about, or many have been complaining about, the reports are long, they're heavy reads, there's a lot of data points, there's a lot of information. I think that, I mean, what we are looking at is like the first information gathering when a company is sharing. These are information about our impacts in a way that is actually systematically estimated, right? So or assessed. So I think that's in itself is really huge. So of course you can discuss what level of granularity you want that. You could say, well, isn't it enough just to say disclose your material impacts, full stop? Or you can go and break it down, right? So I think that, looking at it from the perspective of also having worked with civil society for a long time, I think it's not just about investors making informed decisions. It's also about, the sustainability agenda that we want to push, and accountability of what companies are doing. We've seen so many decades now of companies themselves steering what they want to share in terms of the public domain. There's still a lot of judgment, but this provides a little bit of a skeleton about what you have to talk to. If you remove more from the skeletons, it's just going to be headlines, right? So I think this is actually a really neat balance, given the CSRD, given that we have this chance. If we do more, then companies are going to lose faith in European rule of law, because you can't just throw out legislation and then take it back, and then throw it out and take it back. All these calls for kind of simplification that politicians are making, and picking out kind of numbers from thin air, or thick air maybe. It's sometimes I wonder if they know what exactly that means and why, or if it's just like a numbers call game, right? So I think I personally, having worked with due diligence and also kind of the behavior side of things and not just the transparency side of things, I think that this now is like the best we can do in terms of simplifying it with integrity, without losing the relevant layers of information that we need to contribute to kind of increased accountability for companies over time in the sustainability agenda. But I mean, of course, you could, if you want to call for another 20%, but then what's the point? What's the purpose, right? Then why are we doing it?
We've still got the skeleton, and if you take away the skeleton, well, there's not a lot left, is there? Very good analogy. In the last part,
can I jump on something Sandra just said on the behavior side, or this sort of mirroring effect between behavior and reporting? I think that's one thing that I've been pondering, right? Because there's this insistence that, it's only about transparency. Don't worry, the ESRS don't dictate behavior. It's a transparency framework only. And in a way, I thought, that's true. It's just about disclosing, and it doesn't set the bar for, this is how you need to do it. So it's different to, for instance, the due diligence directive, for instance. That said, in a way, maybe this was a mistake in the comm strategy for the ESRSs, right? Because in a way that can then be read to say, if it's only about putting data out there, and I'm not really as a company experiencing a big inflow of investors that are eager to reward my sustainability progress, then is it just bureaucracy? Is it just paperwork? Whereas the true story of what the ambition is with this is, yes, it's critical for sustainable finance. It's critical for investors that need to direct capital towards the sustainable development. But on the other hand, it's also a critical information framework to support companies in their own dialogues, business decisions, strategic decisions around, are we going this way or that way on critical issues? And that has been undersold, I would say, and that linked to sort of the behavior side. And one thing that makes me quite I guess happy, or that I think is positive with the next version, is that that link to due diligence is kept and reinforced also for the purpose of the materiality assessment, right? If you're already identifying and assessing impacts as part of sustainability due diligence, that is a key input for DMAs. You don't have to redo it for the purpose of a DMA if it's done already. But also in terms of that spirit of what are the different elements of a due diligence, sustainability due diligence management, and what does that then look like in a reporting framework? And I think that's another thing that this version had to deliver on. It had to give a cohesive, or it had to retain that link to some of the other sustainability files that the EU is bringing, and notably the due diligence one.
And this is a final question to you, Signe, and then I've got one more to you, Sandra. Signe, you talk there about the due diligence directive, and the omnibus is, of course, that directive, the corporate sustainability reporting directive, and the taxonomy regulation. I promised at the beginning we'd come back to it, so I have to ask, how does this change the omnibus and the omnibus process? Does it have an impact on what's going on in the European Parliament at the moment? And by the way, we've got a special Frankly Speaking podcast coming up shortly, explaining all the compromise amendments that are being put in the European Parliament, so look out for that. But is there going to be a change at all in the omnibus process because you've done this, or is it like two parallel lines?
I really hope so. I really hope that these things are not siloed and looked at in or discussed in abstract without connecting the dots here, because I really do believe that the overhaul of the ESRS delivers on what we were asked. It's a much simplified version, and that should, in my view, allow another political discussion and exchange about, okay, what does that mean for the threshold, or this, where do we set the bar in terms of how many companies are kicked out essentially of the CSRD? So that, I think, where we've seen very high numbers being considered, right? Initially 80%, but then we're hearing even 95% of the companies originally in scope. So I really hope that those dots are connected, and that politicians recognize that, right, if we actually have a very significantly leaner, simpler, easier to work with, more business friendly, but still robust standard, that can give us a new reflection mode on who can do this in practice.
Sandra, last question to Sandra. Many of the people listening are involved in reporting in businesses, and we're all sometimes accused of being in a bubble or being anoraks or nerds interested in reporting. But you feel strongly that we need to reassert the reason we're doing all of this, the reason that we need European sustainability reporting standards. Let me ask you to say a few words about that.
Well, maybe to connect also to the omnibus question, if I may, on that, I think that there's a societal need for this information. Like, in a way, I can't believe we're having this discussion now after companies have done so much work on due diligence and reporting over so many years. I don't think the problem, to a large degree, is the company's willingness to report. I think it's, I don't know, politicians perhaps, or I don't know, like general opinion. Like this is really a hygiene factor to be reporting on your impact materiality, but also on the making the bridge to the due diligence and the omnibus. Like, I don't know how many times I've had the conversation with clients. So we work both with reporting and due diligence, and where we end up asking the question, why do we have the reporting directive? Why don't we start with how due diligence is supposed to look, how you manage, you identify, you assess your impacts, and then you can talk about how you disclose that. It's a bit like starting from the back, right? Putting the horse before the carriage, or what's the expression? So like we need the due diligence requirements now, because the that the ESRS are really designed, as Signe said, we keep saying it's only disclosures, yeah, but obviously the disclosures are pointing very clearly in a direction, and we need the guidance and the legislation and the diligence for companies to understand what is expected so that they meet. So it's really yin and yang. It's really two parts of the puzzle. We need both sides of the coin. So I really hope that as part of this, I think. And I also maybe want to take the opportunity to really highlight the work that the EFRAG has done, and the EFRAG Secretariat has really kind of, worked incredibly hard to talk about working conditions, incredibly hard over to meet the Commission's asks to simplify and to meet this incredible speed, working really, really hard to make sure that consultations are conducted, surveys and updates, and listening to the tag and then the SRB. So really kind of strongly kind of congratulate and highlight the work that is done by the entire EFRAG. And now I think the politicians really, I mean, this is really, I don't want to say it's a take it or leave it. Obviously, it's not up to me to say that, but I think this is really it. This is a really good piece of work. It still carries the integrity. There's nothing really holding us back from just going with this. This can be the floor, it can be the baseline. Companies can choose to go further. I really don't know what the problem is anymore.
Thank you to both of you. In this podcast, we've heard that the new European Sustainability Reporting Standards are more intuitive. They allow companies to tell a story. There's been a filter put on the materiality assessment to give companies more opportunity to judge based on their business model and activities, not just a topic by topic approach. But there's been an introduction of the concept of the primary user, and it's interesting what implications that may or may not have. We've heard some concerns about what's come out, the relief or delay on financial materiality, the fact that taking out the examples certainly shortens the documents, but of course maybe at the expense of understandability from the company's point of view. And there's been some particular concerns about some of the indicators taken out, for example, on gender, on adequate wages, on workers in the value chain. Sandra and Signe have said that because of the reduction in the number of topics, that ESRS 2, the general disclosure requirements, are absolutely crucial. And they appeal to companies not to misinterpret those and to study and to apply those with integrity. Have they gone too far or not far enough? It's the last chance, says Signe. We have to have got it right. And she's also said that she hopes that politicians in Brussels will see what has been done to simplify and will therefore not reduce the scope of the directives themselves in the omnibus process. And Sandra at the end reminded us of the purpose of why this is being done, not disclosure for disclosure's sake, and the link there is between disclosure and due diligence within the company. So to Signe Lysgaard, to Sandra Atler, I'm sorry we've come to the end of our time today, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Richard. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having us.
Public consultation is now open on the revised European Sustainability Reporting Standards until the 29th of September. Access it via the EFRAG website, where you can also find details of outreach events which they are holding as part of the consultation during September and October before delivering their final recommendations on the 30th of November. You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us now on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again to Signe and to Sandra, and to all of you for tuning into this podcast. Do join us next time, and goodbye.